fascinating is, as a scholar, reading a lot, in the last 5 years, if you Google, you'll discover that one of the most written theses, in other words, people trying to get their PhD in mental health, one of the most written about theses is psychosis versus spirituality. We are not even close to cracking this, but it is becoming such an enormous subject because the average thing that happened is that we've had this huge split between, as we know, the Western mechanistic billiard kind of ball perspective of the universe, which means that it's just atoms bumping into each other and everything is just random chaos. And then that split happened in the 1800s. And then the other direction, of course, is that everything's God and it's spirituality, and these two things are so separate. And as you know, this has caused a massive disease in mankind. How do we know this? An example is if you start hearing voices and you're not in a spiritual environment, well, of course, you're going to end up in a mental institution. Isn't that true? And essentially, if you look at how a mental someone that is in the mental health field deals with things and how a shaman deals with things, they're two different things. But that doesn't mean that they're right in the first place. So the opening of this conversation is that many psychiatrists and many psychologists have started wondering, maybe there's something quite spiritual going on there. And at the same time, many shamans have started going, oh, this person's actually just quite sick. So there has to be a really powerful intersection here, and someone has to start having this conversation. So if I were to describe this gentleman, I'm going to just plug into a book that I've just read. This gentleman is sitting in this dark room and he's extremely uncomfortable and he feels pins and needles spreading from the tips of his toes right up across his chest, almost like a panic attack. And it feels like the pins and needles have almost consumed him. He's not sure if he's breathing. And each time he does breathe, he extremely painfully feels like his crust is breaking open and he's expanding. Everything's spinning. He feels like he's in absolute terror, but at the same time, he's in a state of bliss. And next thing, he breaks into an absolute orgasmic warmth. Now, if you read that is somebody's account in a very well-known book, and they give that to a doctor. The doctor goes, yes, he had a psychotic break. If you read that to the Swami said he had a Kundalini rising, or his Kundalini power came up. So I'm going to talk very quickly about the Eastern, or let's call it the spiritual perspective about what's going on there. And then I'm going to talk about what the Western perspective is, what's going on there. And then we're going to discuss how they're both wrong, because they essentially need each other. They're one and two of the same thing. So that was actually an excerpt from a yogi who wrote about his first Kundalini awakening. And as you can imagine, if you have the right environment or the right people to support you through something like that, it's like the ultimate psychedelic experience. You really want to be in the right place, knowing what's going on, knowing what the ramifications of what's going to happen are. And unfortunately, most Kundalini risings or psychotic breaks are random. So let's begin with the spiritual side. I, as you know, in all my talks, never tell you what I believe. It's not important. What I do is I put the different pieces on the board for you. So let's talk about this idea of this Kundalini awakening. Now, there's quite a lot of arguments about why it's called Kundalini, but the Kunda, there's a Kunda in Sanskrit that means to coil or to almost like be very wound up. There's also a very similar word in Sanskrit, Kunda, which means a cave or darkness. So the idea would be that you have this sacred and etheric energy, the serpent-like energy that has been spoken about for tens of thousands of years. And the idea is that it remains dormant and it is essentially able to be uncoiled like a serpent, and it rises to eventually, and this is, if you think about thousands of different poems and religions, they talk about the lower worlds and the higher worlds and the hero's journey in between. And the idea now in this Eastern perspective would be that the snake begins to uncoil its power, and that the average person never leaves the basement level, the sacral level. In other words, around your anus and your groin. That's where the average person's, according to now Eastern philosophy, okay? And a very rare person would have, if they purify their mind, it's always got to do with their mind. If they purify their mind, that this Kundalini might rise and it might reach the solar plexus. These people tend to be very powerful and very peaceful people. And then you can imagine it can be moved into the heart space. These people tend to become prolific healers, extremely powerful people. And again, into the throat, and you can imagine all the, and what needs to be understood is as this, and I'm going to call it this, I'm not even going to get into a debate about whether it's true or not. I just want us to really tap into this. And as it rises to each energy center, this mighty snake uncurling in these stories, there is an initiation that needs to be faced at each level. Now, I want to stop here and just point out, I did some research this morning on which religions, although they might use a slightly different analogy or representation, believe that there is some sort of force that rises from the base and rises towards the upper heaven worlds, or which is represented essentially by the brain. And it didn't take me long to discover that it is written about in Vedic traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, Judaism, mystic Christianity, shamanism. I could just go on and on and on here. So what am I essentially saying? That all of these religions, although some of them explain it differently, agree that there is this life force that can be, under the correct guidance, can be activated within you. And I want you, because the shamans, for instance, we won't just use Vedic talk speaking, but if you look at it from a shamanic perspective, like for instance, when you're getting ready for that energy to pass your heart space, it is spoken that you will experience the piercing of the heart, which is what psychology calls the death of ego. They don't speak of it in the psychedelic sense. In psychology, the death of the ego is the ultimate betrayal that leaves you at some point in your psychological development questioning absolutely everything about yourself. Of course, we do already know that the death of ego can be something thrust upon you, or it can also be the phoenix setting itself on fire, which is much what the psychedelic revolution is about, right? But in this context, I want you to just consider that as this energy is rising, the amount of complications that can come with it. So, for instance, sexual dysfunction can be one of the first things, because this power literally magnifies those areas and zones. And remember, this is not one religion's belief. This is many, even of the Abrahamic religions have written about this. But why is this important? And I want you to consider that if there's an initiation as it rises, many people will tell you if they come on a shamanic retreat and they get given insights by their ancestors, or they'll tell you that they're shown that their throat is blocked, or many people know subconsciously that their hearts are blocked, right? Can anybody, you don't have to answer, but if any of you in this room aware of any of your chakras maybe that you can sense are blocked? Some people don't have a voice. Some people really battle to control their minds. But what's quite interesting about this idea is that the ultimate level now, if you just imagine that what these religions are saying is true, or as the great occultists, I'm not promoting anything, not even occultism. As the great occultist said, the spine is the magic scepter of 33 points that spinal fluid will raise, in which each one will open up a new level of reality, eventually hitting what they would refer to as your eternal life. And as many of you know, the spinal fluid ends in the pineal part. It's called the pineal, Whereas in Christianity, they spoke about Jacob, very openly spoken about. I can't remember what the Bible verse is, but Jacob eats his marigolds, which is a psychedelic. And then he goes up the 33 stairs of heaven, where he tries to look God in the eye. It's one of the most famous Bible verses. Happens to be called the pineal stairs. And you'll see many, many things like this. But what does this have to do with madness? If this Kundalini, first of all, can be accidentally invoked, there's a couple of ways you can bring the Kundalini to rise. The one is what was done for thousands of years, and this is what we've lost touch with. They would usually by 12, the age of 12, know that there's something unusual about these children, usually hallucinations, trouble with reality, nausea, feeling anxious all the time, things like that. And what would happen essentially is these children would be put in mystery schools. But what's important to notice here is that the child was guided not to become some sort of a psychic aberration, just to be used to having one foot in the one world and one foot in the other. However, his particular, let's call them gifts, would unfold. Now, if you consider the amount of problems that you can have sexually, now move up to your solar plexus and try and connect this in your life. Your solar plexus are, for instance, if you're going through things like you feel no power, maybe you've been abused, maybe like you just feel like the whole world is out to get you. You don't feel like you can stand up for yourself. So that's if you're in the solar plexus zone. The heart, as you know, is, according to all traditions, Mahayana Buddhism, Gnostic Christianity, is literally the bridge between the upper worlds and the lower worlds, is the heart. It is the great guardian that sits between Dante's levels of hell and his higher worlds, all the infernos. So this is written about in nearly every culture. You can use Greek, you can use anything. They're always speaking about the upper worlds, the lower worlds that are represented within you. If you think about the great Hermetic artists, or these are the initiates of Alexandria, who, as you know, everyone from Pythagoras would travel to go and study in these mystery schools. The Hermeticists believed one simple thing, that the entire universe is represented within you. So this journey out of your own sexual organ into your own solar plexus, into your own heart space, was literally the journey of traveling those things through the universe, and that the force of each one is represented within that. In other words, your chakra essentially is a mini sun that connects to that entire dimension. Now, this is all theoretical, right? I'm not telling you if I believe it or not. I'm just plugging you into this, what this has to do with psychosis. Now, these people would be in these schools of initiation, and you can imagine the heartache and the heartbreak of what shamanism, being the oldest belief system in the world, and Vedic being the oldest recorded knowledge, both saying that when you hit the heart, there's these initiations. And then you think of your own life and when things went so horrifically wrong, and how you had to reassess your ego. But now here's the question. This one's pretty obvious. What do you think happens when this power hits your mind? And this is where things become really interesting. Is essentially, one of the things we need to understand about most mystery schools is what they were teaching these initiates, regardless of the school of thought, whether they were from the peristaltic movements or whether they were more like, the most important thing is they were training their imaginations. And the reason they trained their imaginations is because they believed that your mind was quite literally a mini version, or if we want to use old terms, as above, so below. It is a microcosm of the whole universe. So in other words, the darkest part that ever existed in the universe, you can access through your mind, and the lightest parts of God that can ever exist, you could access through your mind, through this aerial, through this inner technology. I mean, it just blows my mind because I've experienced it. But why would this become very important is because if you accidentally just buggering around with too many drugs or too much pressure, or you're doing endless amounts of forceful breathing of certain sacred techniques that you don't really know what you're doing, and you start pumping this Kundalini up and it hits your brain, what usually happens is you have an absolute mind fuck of an experience. And unfortunately, if you're ready for it, what happens is that you're able to face any of the shadows that come up, because the mind, you can imagine the heart has the wounds, the mind has the imagination, it has all these, you can imagine of what it says about darkness and safety and hell and things like that. So traditionally, I need us to understand that what I'm actually saying is that they would not easily push this Kundalini that high. Now, that's the kind of like the theory behind that. And before I move on to now fight for the West, and what I'm saying is I want to tell you what the West knows and our approach towards. So nearly all forms of having some form of psychosis, which if you need a definition, a psychosis is usually established in three areas. It would be very, very erratic, scary, or disorganized thoughts. It would be hallucinations, which are experiencing something that is apparently not there through any of the senses. A lot of people don't know that you can hallucinate through your skin. Like touch, you can have tactile hallucinations, you can have hallucinations, etc. So, and I'm just trying to think if there's any others that I'm forgetting there, because I know that I love to speak away, and some people are actually not even sure about psychosis. Yeah, and delusions. So there's the feeling and the senses and hallucinations of things that are not there. There's the disorganized and the erraticness, but then the big one is delusions. And the delusion could be something quite literally like you think your washing machine is trying to eat you. Okay, so like this delusions, these things can get next level. People can like literally crawl across the floor wetting themselves. Okay, so I'm being very serious. I'm going to get lighter later, but psychosis is no joke. Okay. Now, having said that, let's go a little bit. We've got this idea now that many, many religions have spoken about this idea. They might not agree it's a snake. Some of them believe it's a spirit or whatever it is. But basically it rises and there's the different levels of initiation. And the idea eventually would be for you to be able to pass the level of your mind and it to rise above your mind and to hit the seventh chakra, where the outflowing of the 1,000-petal lotus. In other words, the whole universe is in your palm. And that would be the point. And it's very interesting to also notice that most mystical teachers and writers have warned that it can be reversed, it can be shut down again, which is very important when dealing with a psychotic. You can actually bring it down again. There are various ways, which we got way too much to cover in this short period. But it's good for you to also know that just because you've had a Kundalini awakening, or perhaps you dissolved right through your ego, right to the top of your 1,000 little flowered petal, it's temporary for most people. It's considered something that takes lifetimes to be able to raise that energy and to hold it there. And these are generally people that commit many lifetimes to not ascending, if there is such a thing. Once again, I'm not working with beliefs, but essentially to become what's called a bodhisattva, which means to hold light for the earth. And there are apparently, according to Eastern traditions, many bodhisattvas that are right up into their 1,000-temple lotus that some of them are hundreds of years old. So let's talk psychology a little bit now. Now, what's interesting here is before we talk psychology, I was about 20 years old and I came home from a party, very easygoing party, nothing. I think I had a few, maybe, I can't remember, things called hooches back then. And feeling great, got home, had a chat to my mom, no problem, went to sleep. And about an hour later, I woke up into that was the end of my life as I knew it. I woke up first being aware of the fact that I was in a full conversation with an entire group of people in the room. And I was like unable to stop myself from having the conversation, but at the same time became terrified to what was actually going on. I was essentially between two realities. I was feeling terrible. I'm not going to go too far in it. But what's really interesting is that over the next hour, it just got stranger and stranger and stranger. And I felt like with each breath, I was expanding wider and wider and wider into the universe. I was a very, very, I pushed myself very hard spiritually when I was a teenager. Long story short, it occurred to me probably at about 1 o'clock that morning, after now waking my parents up to tell them that there's something seriously wrong. Like I had taken my clothes off, I was pacing outside. It occurred to me at that stage that maybe somebody, this is how scared I was, somebody had slipped a crap load of LSD into my drink or something. That is the only logical explanation I could come up with. I was so scared that I basically phoned all my friends I was that night, screaming on them the telephone, asking them what they had done to me. And that's just, I mean, I'm talking about walking across the floor, and it was felt like hands were grabbing me, and it was a hell beyond hell. It took me about, now, of course, I had this realization that perhaps something terrible had happened. Like, I have no idea. And I cracked, or I in some way fractured my psyche. And probably over the next 6 to 9 months, I have very little memory about what actually happened. I just remember being very, very trapped in an absolute hell. In the beginning, I was so scared, it didn't even occur to me to try and drink alcohol or take drugs. I was literally just constantly like terrified. So the reason I add that in here now is because I still to this day have no idea whether I had whether it was a psychotic break or whether I had a Kundalini arising, but you know what I do know? What I do know is that the hell that ensued of that was 10 years of mental aberrations and emotional aberrations have led me onto such an epic quest to ask such big questions that I've ended up doing the work that I do today. So I love that. I love that in some ways, nothing could actually go wrong if you decide to, I love the word, as I said, from Greek mythology, Chiron, the wounded healer. I love the term that something in your life is chironic. It was the poison, but it was also the medicine, And I like that because I clutching a bottle of vodka many years later in my desperation, I discovered that maybe I could numb it or possibly dying while trying to do it. I remember crying in the dark and promising myself that if I ever come out of this, that I'm going to find other people like me and try and figure out what happened. Because I was like a perfectly well-rounded individual until then I wasn't. So I share that with you a little bit just to plug you into, I still, to be honest, have quite bad PTSD from some of the things that happened to me. And it's taken me a lifetime to learn to do things like to sleep. Took me years to learn to sleep with the light off and things like that. I share that with us just because the humanity side is quite missing when it comes to psychosis. I don't think many people realize there are mental hells, and our mental institutions are filled with people that are actually there. So what's so interesting is if we get to the psychology side, now let's look at what they kind of know. One interesting thing, though, we're crossing from the spiritual shaman world into modern psychology. Just for interest, though, Carl Jung and Freud both said there's definitely a Kundalini. Just put that in your pipe. So the two most prolific psychologists, today there's no conversation about Kundalini, but if you go and, there's something very special about Carl Jung, wasn't there? He started talking about this collective unconscious, and sure, still quite limited, but he gave birth to psychotherapy. And I just want you to consider that. So Freud and Jung had a very, very deep look into this thing, if there's such a thing as a Kundalini, and they both said yes. So there is a hell of a lot of information. Now, if you were to, in modern psychology, to Google what is psychosis, what you will get told is what it is. If you were to ask what causes it, we'll discuss it a little bit. We really don't know much. What's really interesting, though, is psychosis tends to be measured in 3 ways. So if you were to see somebody sit down in front of you and you're trying to decide if they've got psychosis, the first thing is you've got to have look at their thoughts and their behaviors. So their behaviors tend to be extremely erratic and their thoughts are very, very broken and disconnected. And that's important. That also moves into delusions, and you've got to establish basically whether the person, you remember in my job, I work on the psychology side and on the shamanistic side. So when someone sits down, I'm trying to ascertain whether this person is literally having a psychotic break or an a spiritual breakthrough. And there are certain things that I'm going to say at the end that make it obvious which one it is. So if the person's having delusions can become really, really scary. And then there's hallucinations. Now, believe it or not, physical, as in seeing with your eyes, hallucinations is actually one of the rarest ones. If we think it's common, it's just because we've done a lot of psychedelics and things like that. But we're talking about the average person who pulls into a psych ward. The type of hallucinations that are more common are tactile, like you feel something's touching you, auditory hallucinations, voices, things like that. These things are far more common. And what's quite interesting when you look at this is if you were to go and do your first year or studying this kind of psychotic breaks and things, they will give you a whole lot of reasons for what can cause it. And these are 100% true. Stress can cause it. What else? Drugs can cause it. Alcohol can cause it. Prescription medication can cause it. Underlying mental disorders can cause it. And mood disorders can cause it. And it's quite clever because I'm basically suggesting in this talk that the future of mental health is that we are going to have to be trained in the spiritual and the psychological sides for us to be able to help people. And here's an example. If you come to me, I'll just give you a random example, and you're presenting with having tactile hallucinations and very aberrant behavior and you're seeming very uncomfortable, I can almost tell you immediately you're going through withdrawals. Now, this is why it's so complicated to separate this. So 90 times, like for instance, if someone drank for 5 days or did a drug for many, many days, and they're trying to come off that drug, there are certain spectrums of hallucinations that you will be able to almost predict. So the feeling like something's touching you all the time is generally 90% of the time is some sort of a substance-induced psychosis. So this is why we really need the Western medicine. Does it make sense? Can you imagine you've got the experience? Because I mean, I've only been working with psychosis for 10 years and I'm learning things all the time. So they have certain charts that are really, really clever. And there's all sorts of types of psychosis, and some is very easy to explain. But what actually causes a person to stay in psychosis is the area that they're not able to touch onto. Now, even this afternoon, I thought I'd educate myself, so I didn't put my foot in it. And I picked 3 guys, each half-an-hour videos to explain what causes schizophrenia. It was the biggest waste of my biggest hour and a half waste of time I could have possibly. They all basically said absolutely nothing for 30 minutes. They have absolutely no idea. They keep saying things like, yeah, and they can feel things and then this, but they have absolutely no idea. And therefore, I want to use schizophrenia, which essentially is, I think, what I eventually developed. I refused to take the label, but schizophrenia can come and go. Schizophrenia can be very prominent at certain parts of your life. But essentially, if I were to take on what I think eventually happened to me, I went schizophrenic. That does not mean you have multiple personalities. A lot of people like to believe that. But one of the aspects that were most strong for me were the fears, the delusions, things like that. Now, why I want to use schizophrenia as an example for you is it is almost impossible to explain schizophrenia unless you start actually bringing maybe spirituality in, But most people are not willing to do that. And that's where Carl Jung and people like that came in with the collective unconscious. I'd love you guys to inspire yourself. So first of all, very controversially, very often people that think they are spiritually awakened have just broken some of their mechanisms. They've put themselves under way too much stress, partied way too hard, taken way too much information in. I mean, just think about this. If stress can cause it alone, right? Alcohol can cause it alone. And this is, we know this for a fact, right? Because you have to decide when a person comes into the clinic, you've got to try and decide quite quickly what could be going on there. Prescription medications, mood disorders, all sorts of things. And I just wanted us to consider that there are a couple of really dangerous things happening in the world right now that I kind of want to finish off to leave as a thought thing in our pipe. The first one is we have romanticized being mentally unstable as being awake. And I can kind of understand where it comes from. But tell me you don't all have that spiritual friend who's absolutely cuckoo, that you convinced is actually has having deliriums. And they're convinced that they're just so super woke or awake. And I think that this conversation has got to be, and it's controversial as hell. It really does. So that's where one of the first problems comes in is, how do you tell the difference between whether a person is actually having difficulty within their awakening? Do you see the difference? Or is just in a psychotic break? And there's quite a few things that are important to realize is if we go back to the fact that most people, when they started having these awakenings, had a guru or a shaman or something to talk them through the stages. Nowadays, we think awakening is getting on the internet and reading the scariest negative agendas that we can possibly find, filling our minds with it, and then having an anxiety attack 24 hours a day. And when people ask you what's wrong, you go, you just don't know what's going on, man. That's literally what awakening looks like nowadays. I mean, and it's quite extraordinary. So at some stage, I am suggesting that we need a little bit of a merge back between spirituality and psychology and psychiatry, or Western mechanization and spirit. And I do believe that that's why I'm good at my job. And that's why I believe that I have the honor of getting to work with people that are not sure who to go to. The average person who comes to me has already been to a doctor and they've already been to a healer. And I have a very, very particular belief about psychosis. And I believe that what essentially happens in psychosis, what the difference between a panic attack and an anxiety disorder and why, when it actually becomes a fracturing of the mind, is only once spirituality becomes involved. Because for the average person, I want you to consider this. When the average person has a panic attack, what is the scariest thing that they can think of? Death. And therefore, the average person, when they're having a panic attack, they go, and they're freaking, and the brain's going, think, what the hell's happening to us? Boom, we must be dying. And that is where the basement lies, or the ceiling lies for the average person. Now, we are buggering around with a lot of things because we're lazy, without any sort of, let's call it, discipline, and we're expanding our minds because we are literally at the moment obsessed with our minds. We don't realize that our minds just is one part of us. And we're so expanded into our minds that what essentially is happening now is that we are becoming possessed by our minds. Now, why this conversation sounds so intense, I want you to show you now, this is the average person I work with. This is what happens. They read all these books about all these negative agendas. They start believing about things like intrinsic evil. I mean, one of the first things you have to do if you're going to go on a spiritual path is you have to ask yourself what you believe. And you have to be so steadfast in that thing. Do you think I could do these entity removals and things of people if I honestly believed that I was in any danger? So my point is quite simply that until you know how you feel about things like intrinsic evil, what does that mean? Is there an evil separate to us? That's one of the most important questions you can ever ask in your life. If you want to know what makes people like me who can have whatever's going on, I've been working, as some of you know, with ayahuasca entity removals and things for over a decade. I have never feared to put my hands on those people because I do not believe in intrinsic evil. And unless I'm a match for that thing, which needs to teach me something about the vibration I'm playing in, that thing means nothing to me. Now, I'm not telling you that's the truth. I'm telling you that that allows me to be fearless when people talk about possessions. Why would you want to even involve yourself in something like that if you really didn't know how you felt about things like that? And how this plays out, so let's get to the point. This is how a psychotic break happens. Someone goes to visit, let's make a few psychotic breaks. One person goes to see a witch doctor. Other person goes to see a shaman. Other person goes to a church they've never been to. Another person takes a really weird drug, but they're not sure what it is, and they're so scared it might expand their man. But what all these things have in common is that there are undefinables, or could I say there's no ceiling? They are there's a better word here. But they are etheric. In other words, you have no idea how much that witch doctor could have affected you, or you've got no idea what does that drug actually do to your brain. So the imagination suddenly, in its state of fear, has absolutely no ceiling. There's no ceiling. Now, what all 5 of these people are going to have in common is most times it wouldn't happen, but they have something that happens which could be not related in any way to going to have seen that witch doctor, or to been in that church they're not used to, or to been seen that healer that creeped them out. And suddenly they're driving along and they start having an anxiety attack. During this anxiety attack, it gets to what we call like 911, like, oh my God, this is the anxiety attacks of all of anxiety attacks. And the brain does what it always does. The brain starts to go, oh my God, what's happening? What's happening? And now you've got a whole new level of hell that some people take years to have to heal. What happens? The brain suddenly goes, oh my God, someone's taken a piece of your soul. It's different for everyone. There's something sucking on you. And it occurs to you. So what has happened? Because, like I'm very animate when I speak about this stuff, but like, this is very real, hey? And it's, in some ways, it's quite comedic. So what's actually happened is that before that, there was only a basement of physical things that could happen. Now that someone has started to enter looking for ethereal or beyond physical reasons, there is nothing that can stop them. What do I mean by that? I mean, there's no basement. The bigger your imagination is, the more high. Have you guys ever sat? Dude, here's an example. This is how psychosis works for anyone who really wants to know if they get it. And this is not like, or if what it feels like. If you sit down right now and you're feeling completely normal, this conversation might have you a little bit anxious, but like you're sitting on a beach and you're lying back and you think about death, you'll be like, you don't feel particularly, it's like there's a part of you, it's like, I think I'm a bit nervous. Like sometimes you have days where you're like, what changes between the day when you're very nervous and the day that you're totally okay with it? What changes is your baseline of anxiety or psychic fear. And what happens in a person of psychosis is that certain areas of their hypothalamus and blah, 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 and all these primal areas of the brain have decided, oh my God, this is worse than death. Something is after our soul. And the level of alarm bells that start going off for that person can last from 1 hour to many, many years, like it did for me, going into heightened states of arousal, never being able to sleep, maybe sleeping a few minutes at a time. And it's really important to understand that what's essentially happened there is that we have been disintegrated by a fear or a thought. Now, these are very extreme examples. Some people just have trauma spectrums and they're very functional, but they know something's wrong. And the majority of my work, long before I put people in altered states so that we can bring it up, long before we start to clear it out, we have conversations where I help lead the person to actually realize what the terrifying thing that occurred to them was in the first place, and their power starts to come back after that. I intend to keep using this technique for the rest of my life and learning more and more. If you want to be inspired, I only discovered her yesterday. Her name is Eleanor Langdon. She is now a very well-known psychiatrist, but she used to hear voices and was on every drug known to man. And she decided one day that maybe these voices are trying to help me, even though they're screaming at me and telling me to hurt people. And you need to hear her version of the story. And what she discovered was that the voices for her were just a really clever way of showing her what kind of feelings she was having. So they matched her. So if she was looking at the world really scary, and I want you to hear her version. But she's even started this organization, which is totally different to what I'm doing, but this is the future, where she is saying, oh, thank you. Is it Eleanor Langdon? Thank you. And she has started this organization called Something for Voices now, where people that hear voices kind of get together in the whole therapy. It's very shamanic, isn't it? And they're like, oh, what are your voices telling you? Oh, it's possibly this. It's a kind of psychotherapy. And I want to point out, for those of you that do have schizophrenia or anything, or anyone who hears this, there are a few proofs that we have that mental illness is actually far more of a spiritual initiation. And one of them, for instance, is that in a study done in 2010, they studied over 10,000 people with schizophrenia in Africa, in certain countries, versus the United States. And one of the most fascinating things they discovered was that the voices of the kids or the teenagers that were studied in Africa didn't find their voices scary, or that the voices were more like what they called pains. They were irritating. They were like not malicious. That was the major difference in the study, whereas the voices in the Americans' head were like, go kill your family. And they could not find any of these parallels in the African studies, which we could have another hour and a half conversation. I certainly don't think that means that Americans are possessed. I think it has a lot to do with where your basement of fear is. And if you are expanding your imagination, like most people do with television and horror films and things like that, knowing what the imagination was to the mystic, then when you hit one of those states and you start hearing voices, the last thing you think is, what does this tell me about myself? Maybe I should sit and go be with this. No. On the top of that, if you go to a doctor, they're going to slap you with a label so fast, stick you under so many medications. And that's why I want you to go listen to that lady's story. I think she's got a TED talk where it's 15 minutes long. And she, just through her story, and I'm sharing my story, it is now quite normal for me to be able to lie down in my bed and to exit my body. I can float around. I can go on adventure. I see colors around things. I have realized now that it's just was me expanding into what I am. But I would love to be romantic about it. I still have seizures. I still battle with addiction. I still have periods of madness that are so intense that I actually don't know what to do with myself. I switch my phone off for days. So, and you're going to read this in a lot of these stories, and it's not true that you romantically realize that you have these spiritual gifts and suddenly everything's absolutely okay. And as Teal Swan, whether you like her or not, I don't know, I haven't spent much time reading her. She mentioned that we've got this terrible thing that happened in the 80s, is that we glorified and built up through the marketing systems of that is now controlling our world, this idea of these perfect teachers, and all was hidden. And we were so shocked as these great teachers came falling down one after the other. The perfect guru, those guys don't exist. We're all in this mess. And some of us know a little bit more about the mind and emotions and etherical worlds. And I think that I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing. And what I love is that I get very, very, every now and again, I get to work with someone that believes that they cannot be reached and that they are in such deep hell that they burn and cut, and like literally you cannot even get through to them. And I have got through to many of them just with talking after a few months, like getting to find what that thing they secretly believe. And it's nearly always something to do with some malevolent spirit or something that was input into their mind through what I would call reckless spiritual reading. And that kind of leads me to my closing point that I want to make, is that you really need to ask yourself if you believe in intrinsic evil. And if you really believe that mankind is fallen now, you obviously weren't there in the dark ages, and you obviously weren't there before that. There has always been a system of domination and control on this earth. Unless you were a king for hundreds of years, you basically, like, you didn't have much going for you. So this idea that we suddenly at the epoch of darkness is absolutely ridiculous. We just have enough information to become fully aware of how it is that we are manipulated and controlled. But once again, if you look at what happened when the Dark Ages hit Earth, they were followed by the Renaissance. In other words, whenever great compressions of darkness happen, just like within your own chakras, they cause awakenings of new abilities. Look at what the Renaissance was. It was a rebirth in thought. It was a rebirth in art. It was a rebirth in religion. So every time you are part of some sort of a suppressional period of reality, you are in an awakening. It can be no other way. Just like when your heart is hurting or you've just had a heartbreak, you could say that your heart is being attacked by darkness. But you could also say at the same time that you're learning, like what did Rumi say? How many times does your heart have to break before it's fully open? So I don't really want you to agree with me on anything. I want you to just really leave this conversation asking yourself a few questions. I have worked probably with 100 people that believed that they were possessed. And once again, in this subject, we have the same problem. The psychologist will not agree with the shaman about what's going on there. And I say it's completely irrelevant, but this is the argument. The shaman's going to say that there's something that has attacked him and taken control. And the psychologist's going to go, he's lost control. But the same thing has happened, but they just believe that it's some sort of something inside, you've lost control to a different part of your personality, etc., etc. My argument is, why are we arguing about this? Because if you guys want to hear about it, I've got a video called Obsessions and Possessions and an entity named Bob, where I tell the story about how you help these people. And I'm telling you now, it's the same every single time. Once that person realizes that they are strong enough to repossess their house, do you know that there was no word for being, obsessions and possessions and an entity named Bob. Thank you. There was no word for possession until the 1800s. Go check this out. The word was obsession. Obsession. Think about that just for a while. And only through that scary kind of Christian period, go right into the Vedic teachings, you'll see that even in China, there were demons and dragons, but they were things that if you just fed them, and like, it was never this big scary thing that could take your life over. That's a new invention. But it's always the same thing. Things that people that think they are possessed, they always gradually degrade themselves. And what I mean is they don't eat well. They tend to take a lot of drugs, eat a lot of alcohol. Their physical vehicle starts to weaken. Therefore, their energy system starts to weaken. And similar to the psychosis, which is this panic attack that suddenly dawns with this idea that no doctor could possibly convince them out of, you have this realization all of a sudden that this person is what they think possessed. Yes, absolutely. I read the comment that Jesus, used to drive demons out of, but there's my conversation. If you think about all the stories about Jesus driving, he drove them out of people and even into pigs. It's always been accepted that there are entities and things like that, but not this this thing that we have, like we literally, people have lost their lives. They think something's controlling them. And I think it's just really important to realize now, if we want to rebuild that person with possession. So I've never get into the conversation with whether the guy's possessed or not. It's always the same process. You have to get them fit. You have to rebuild their body. You have to remove the things that were causing the illness, and you have to allow homeostasis to start taking place. And only once the physical vehicle starts to restructure itself, and perhaps it's energetical, then you can start to actually go with them to look at what the delirium is, or this toxic idea or thought. The point would be that I've never seen a person who doesn't suddenly start realizing that they have the power sort themselves out. It sometimes takes time. And that's why I get so upset with spiritual healers. When you send someone to a spiritual healer and they tell them, oh, there's something on you, you're in such trouble. And this person goes into this absolute, and I know they believe it, but I'm tired of picking up the pieces of, if you are a spiritual healer and you can't handle the heat in the kitchen, in other words, if you're scared every time someone comes to you and says that they hear things at night, or that they have an illness, and you have to always give it a label of some dark thing, you're not helping the world. That person can't heal from their psychic friend telling them. I get a phone call at least once a week where someone's like, I was doing so well, and then I went to see my psychic and they said that there's entities, and I'm like, oh my God, if I hear this word entity again, I just want to absolutely shit myself. And yet I work with them, because the same thing's going to happen, regardless of whether the entity is present or not. Once I have taken the time, or somebody else has taken the time to convince them that that thing has no power, they completely surpass it. So why are we putting this into somebody's space in the first place? And that's literally what that whole talk about working with possessed people is about. Is that, like, why are we arguing whether it came from the outside or the inside? As soon as you convince the person, hey, you're in charge here, boom. And it takes time, because they have to rebuild their body. And maybe something does take over if you allow yourself. But the solution is always the same. So that leaves us with a huge conversation, which will trigger a lot of people. And you'll probably notice that sometimes it's psychosis and sometimes it is a spiritual awakening. And maybe what we don't have is the people to help us go through these things. I think that's what's been lost. And maybe we're putting labels on people too quickly that are actually just experiencing huge initiations. And also, maybe it's healthy to take the advice from the yogis that we shouldn't force Kundalini awakenings, because there's nothing sexy about mental illness. I can tell you that. Anyone who's ever experienced how long an hour can be, there's the only way, I can't explain it to you, but if you ask someone how long is an hour and they go, then you know that mental illness is no joke. And I also do think it is a really big part of our expansion. So that gives us closing with the hour. I'm just going to, of course, feel free to stay in the room if you want to share something with us. And yeah, it's a very, very big subject. But guys, you know what? I just want to add one thing. Do you see what this has to do with the information war nowadays? Do you know one of the first things I do when I have someone that I'm working with that's psychologically ill is I tell them to stop reading spiritual shit? Because you know what happens? They do absolutely fine when they read something that makes them think they are okay. But a lot of the information that has been released in the world now is to disempower you, to make you think the agendas are more complicated than the simplicity of the fact that you're in spirit right now. I mean, this agenda about the fact that we are living in a simulation is like the most dark, archonic idea that's ever been released. Because once you decide you're in a simulation, you feel like you're trapped and far away from God, and everything is mechanistic and controlling you. I mean, there are certain ideas that are so toxic. So I often get these people over a 3-week period to be completely sane and to start calming down, because what did we establish? It's the level of anxiety that causes the level of delusions. And then they go and read some new book about some alien species that's eating you or something. And I'm not even saying it's not true. And then I can't calm them down for 6 months again. So if you want to know one of the best things you can do, if you're battling with psychosis, stop reading, stop watching TV, learn to surf, learn to walk on the ground, spend time with good people, and make some prayers and meditations, and stop filling your imagination with ridiculous things, which might not be ridiculous. You see, that's what's such a beautiful thing about the subject. But if you believe they've got power, you're in deep dwang. Okay.